Happy welcome to all of you. My name is Patrick Breyer. I'm a member of the European Parliament and of the Greens EFA Group. And I would like to thank you for joining the launch of our group's campaign to ban biometric mass surveillance. Face surveillance is only the most prominent example of this biometric mass surveillance. But apart from this recognition technology, it is also being used for behavior detection. So that means that algorithms will analyze our behavior in the public and flag it, report it to the police, for example, if it is unusual in some way. And all of those technologies, of course, come with a chilling effect on society, that people will tend to behave conformly like everybody else. So it reduces diversity, and it comes with a great risk of abuse, obviously, for other purposes than these systems have been installed for. And that's why our political group calls on the European Commission to propose a ban on biometric mass surveillance in publicly accessible spaces by public authorities. Now, unlike the European Union, numerous cities in the US have already started to ban such technology in public spaces, and in some cases even in private spaces. And only yesterday, Massachusetts banned the use of facial recognition technologies by the police, which is a great precedent, of course. And Europe really needs to catch up on this issue. And that's why we've launched this campaign to bring together citizens, civil society organizations, academia, and members of parliaments to raise awareness, to advocate for the prohibition of this kind of mass surveillance, and to push the EU Commission to make a legislative proposal for an EU-wide ban. Now, in our event today, we would like to draw attention to the discriminatory effects and the built-in bias in biometric surveillance technologies and how they specifically affect certain groups of people more than others. And we are very happy to welcome our three experts today. From New York, we have Mutali Nkoni, and she is AI policy advisor for the United Nations, member of the TikTok Advisory Board, and CEO of AI for the People, a non-profit communications firm that seeks to change tech neutrality narratives. And prior to this, she worked in AI governance. She holds fellowships at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University and the Institute of Advanced Study at Notre Dame, and is an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Welcome, Mutali.
Thank you. It's so great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. From London, we welcome Gracie Bradley, and she's a human rights expert and also a campaigner, and she's interim director at Liberty. Her special interests include state surveillance, migration, policing, and equality. So all the issues that matter today. Welcome, Gracie.
Thanks ever so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And from Brussels, we have Ella Jakubowska. She is a policy and campaigns officer at European Digital Rights, EDRI, which is the largest European network defending fundamental rights and freedoms online. She leads the network's advocacy on biometric technologies and is one of the coordinators of the recently launched Pan-European Reclaim Your Face campaign to ban biometric mass surveillance. Ella is also involved in work on artificial intelligence, on human rights due diligence, and on non-discrimination. Welcome, Ella.
Hi, great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I would like to point out to all viewers that you can submit questions to our expert throughout the event, either via Twitter or via YouTube. And we will make a selection and have a round of questions towards the end of the debate. So let's hear your questions. And now to start. Biometric surveillance methods, especially in times of this COVID-19 pandemic, have been much debated. But Mutali, you've been researching the use of biometric data and the risk of misinterpretation by so-called artificial intelligence. Could you explain to us what is biometric data and why is it so sensitive?
Yeah, sure. So very briefly, I've been looking at biometrics now for probably close to about 5 years, but most intimately around a congressional ban of the use of biometrics in housing. And what biometric technologies do is that they take they take measurements of the body. So things that we would typically think about as health data, and at least here in the United States, be covered by privacy laws that are very specific to anything to the body. So for example, in facial recognition that we're looking at, in order for a system to recognize a face, it would take measurements between my eyes, from my cheek to my ear, and between my lip and my chin and others, and then create a statistical model that it matches against what have been labeled as faces within the data set. The reason that biometric technologies, and facial recognition is just one, we have voice recognition, which is used by the police to listen. At least here in New York, if they think they hear a gunshot, which isn't accurate, we have gait recognition, the way that you walk, and on and on and on. So if you think about any type of determination that's made by a doctor, those same types of determinations are used in these technologies. And the key issue that we have two key issues. Number one, in the medical setting, there is a set of ethics and there's a set of legal rules around how that data can be used. The reason that that data is so important is that typically it cannot be changed, and it identifies you in such a way that you would never be able to be forgotten. So it can be a very powerful surveillance and tracking tool. But number two, and this is really where my work comes to life, is in the case of facial recognition, there is a 40% error rate against people for dark skin. And what that means is this June, I became a US citizen. I had to do biometric measuring, which included a facial scan. And on the bottom of the picture, it said my face scan had a 94% error rate. That meant that the facial recognition scan that identifies me as a US citizen did not recognize me, was not able to pick up my features as being a face. And the reason that that's really implausible in terms of public use is billions of dollars are being spent in the research and the development of these companies. I'm working on a campaign with the UN that's looking at a global ban. So we're looking at most places that sit outside of Europe and the African continent. So I had the project in the US. We're looking at India. We're looking at Mongolia. We're also looking at the West Bank. But in that campaign, one of the things that we're pointing out is it's not just that facial recognition exists, it's that it's often linked to this idea that we have about security and security forces. And who are they in the United States? They're police forces at the municipal level, federal investigations, Federal Bureau of Investigations, and immigration. So these are the most marginalized communities where these technologies are being used to control and to track populations who are already overrepresented in these systems of control. And so I would just want to leave the audience with this idea that there is the technology that can recognize you from the way that you look, from the way that you sound, from the way that you walk. Those are attributes, physical attributes that cannot be changed, and once in a database will continually keep you in that database. The databases that they're being kept in are those that are weaponized routinely against the most vulnerable, the disabled, people who are Black, women, people who are trans or non-binary, because the way faces are labeled are male or female, but we have a larger gender spectrum. And then the last thing is that in any other environment, this information would be protected because it's considered so sensitive. And very lastly, one of the things we've seen with COVID is this repackaging and this reemerging of surveillance as a public health asset. And that's also another place where facial recognition could easily be layered upon existing tracking protocols. So it poses a massive existential threat at this time.
Thanks, Mutali. I've been working on mass surveillance for so long now, and the same problems keep reoccurring in all the time when they try to use and impose these kind of mechanisms. So thank you for putting this out. And now, Ella, IDRI has been publishing reports on the use of these technologies in the European Union. And could you give us an insight of some of the existing projects of public biometrics surveillance right here in Europe?
I absolutely can, but how much time do you have? Because this is happening in Europe and it is happening a lot. But according to our EU leaders, it shouldn't be possible because we have the General Data Protection Regulation. But as I'm hoping to emphasize, the reality on the ground is really different. And there's this enormous legislative gap where people in Europe are not having our biometric data protected. So there's so many examples to choose from, but I want to hone in on one in particular in Europe that I find especially chilling, and it's the use of a so-called innovative biometric surveillance system that was deployed by the Italian municipality of Como at the end of last year and beginning of this year. And one of the things that this system claimed to do was detect loitering. And we don't actually know how they trained the system to differentiate between loitering compared to other human activities. But I really cannot see how this could be done without some form of discriminatory profiling and biased assumptions. And this is especially evident when it was revealed that the exact space where this system was deployed in Como is the very same one that in 2016 housed hundreds of migrants who were stranded after being turned away at the border only 4 kilometers away. So this is not a coincidence about where authorities choose to deploy these biometric technologies. And it's exactly what civil society have been warning against, warning that the use of biometric surveillance technologies in and across our public spaces not only makes really normal behaviors like walking, having your hood up, or looking at your phone apparently appear suspicious, but also that the people who bear the brunt of these technologies are those that are already marginalized by society or that do not conform to stereotypes or prejudiced perceptions of what normal looks like. And that's exactly the types of communities that Mutali just listed. And so luckily this system in Como has been stopped, at least for now, thanks to investigations by journalists and Hermes Center, which is a civil society group in Italy, who put pressure on the Data Protection Authority to act, except there are now at least 2 other Italian cities that are experimenting with exactly or almost exactly the same technology. So we're constantly having to chase after authorities and police forces that are deploying these technologies without considering our human rights. And I'll just really briefly touch on 2 other examples just to give a flavor for the spectrum of abuses of our biometric data and our freedoms that we're seeing. So there's the infamous eye border control lie detector system that was trialed at EU borders as part of immigration processes. Not only was it based on, the whole premise of detecting if someone is lying is scientifically not validated and has really, really worrying links to face science, physiognomy, and you can even see how it's rooted in ideas of eugenics. And beyond that, it's a technology that by definition is used by those that have the power to grant or deny people's right to movement. And it's used against those that are in need of accessing this right. So that's one more really concerning use. And lastly, one of my personal favorites, so to speak, which was the Belgian Data Protection Authority finding out that Belgian police had deployed biometric mass surveillance at Brussels airport only because a police rep was boasting about it in a magazine interview, and a member of the Belgian Data Protection Authority happened to read that article. So we're really seeing widespread and systematic targeted deployments against minoritized and racialized groups, a lack of transparency, a lack of science, and really serious potential infringements of Europeans' fundamental rights.
Oh, thank you, Ella, for that overview. And it's surprising just how widespread this kind of technology is in Europe today. Now, mass surveillance technologies are generally known to greatly threaten our fundamental rights and liberties, especially freedom of expression and privacy, but also freedom of assembly and much more. And today we are specifically looking at the discriminatory effects of biometric technologies. And let's take a closer look at just how biased these algorithms can be. And one example of racial bias that went viral this year is an experiment, the results of which were published by Tony Asieri on Twitter this year. This is the tweet that he posted. And basically, he tested the Twitter facial recognition AI by uploading an image of US Senator Mitch McConnell, here on the left, and former President Barack Obama. And basically, what he found was that the facial recognition AI would consistently crop the image so that it would center Mr. McConnell rather than Obama. So you can see that here. And this is what he got. Others then repeated his experiment and used other examples of images that showed both a black and a white person. And Twitter's facial recognition algorithm continued to crop pictures to show the non-dark skinned character only, even in this cartoon, as you can see. Now, at the same time, there has been research not only on the racial, but also on the gender bias of facial recognition algorithms. And most prominently, Joy Bolamwini, the founder of the US Algorithm Justice League, has found that algorithms systematically misidentify female faces, especially where they have a darker skin tone. And you can see some statistics here on this slide and note just how great the gap is for that group of people. And so I'd like to ask you, Mutali, can you explain us what's happening here and why the algorithm, Twitter algorithm selects, images of white people over dark-skinned ones, and how it happens that these algorithms just how they are working, and
Yeah.
also why darker female faces, for example, are systematically misidentified?
Yeah, sure. So the way AI systems are intelligent, so kind of just to reverse, the reason that these systems are called intelligent is that they can conduct the same processes, cognitive processes that we would think of the five senses. So sight, we haven't really seen touch, but taste, smell, those are the five senses. And in the case of facial recognition, it uses a protocol called computational vision. And the way that we train systems to see is by feeding them, potentially for the sake of this conversation, 1 million different pictures of faces. So these pictures are often taken from people in the lab, people in existing data sets, people who are just around the research team. In the case of the systems that Joy Bulawimi was looking at in the gender shade studies, these were commercial systems, IBM, Microsoft, Amazon. She was looking at those systems. And what we can infer, because obviously we cannot see the algorithm because of IP laws in the United States, where the training data sets were overwhelmingly inclusive of white men. So what that meant was, as the machine is looking at all of these different pictures, these digital images, and taking the measurements that I described before between the eyes, the nose, the ears, etc., it's building up a statistical model that normalizes the white male face. The second part of that is that once these statistical models are created, they become attached to certain labels. So one of the things, one label is typically man, the other label is typically woman. And within those labels, it takes a median idea of what a man's face would look like or what a woman's face would look like. In the case of misgendering, one of the things that we found out were women became associated with length of hair. So most Black women, me included, do not have hair that falls significantly past their shoulders naturally. Most Black women don't. However, that does not mean that they do not identify as women. So as those systems were being created, which don't just take the measurements, but also take the typical conditions, women with dark skin, we've already talked about, were misidentified, but also women with short hair were typically misgendered. And then if we take that a step further to women who, trans women and other femmes who may not have been identified as female at birth, your face scan isn't going to change. So all of these pictures of white men where there is a median measurement for the places in the facial architecture that I described do not change if the person then realigns with their true gender, decides that they're transgender, or just typically has short hair. So it's not even as complicated. And one of the things I was thinking about was here in the United States, the Hollywood actress, a Hollywood actor now, Elliot Page, came out yesterday as transgender male. Elliot looks very similar to the way he looked prior to coming out as a transgender male. However, within a facial recognition system, that transgender male is going to be misgendered, because physically, Elliot's face has not changed. It has not changed after the gender realignment. So if we think about machines as learning from historical pasts to make predictions about what's in our future, that's where much of the tension lies, because machines are not dynamic. A machine will not be able to pick up that Elliot Page is the same person as a transgender man as I'm not going to say his prior name because that would be disrespectful, but when gendered as a female at birth, it's the same person. There is no reading of social context. And if we put that together with what Emily was saying around the facial recognition system in the European Union, where, you know, walking is also now not a safe activity based on some of the inferences that this machine is making, or looking at your phone, and then the misgendering, and then the misrecognizing, you very quickly get to wrongful arrest and incrimination, which I'm happy to discuss later. But what we're doing is training these machines to take a very Eurocentric, very white-centric, very male-centric view of who is a human, and completely disregarding everybody else. And that actually tracks with many of the laws across the world. So in the US, men could only hold property. Men were the only people with legal rights. Those men were also white. And those men also came from a certain social class. So something like loitering or having to do excessive walking wasn't something that they would have to do. They had servants. And we're seeing this recreation of those norms and reinforcement of those political beliefs through these systems.
Thank you, Matali. And yes, that's the terrible thing about these algorithms and the bias that comes with it, because when used for identifying people and recognizing people, this bias will actually result in a higher error rate for certain groups of people, which means that they will more often be wrongfully flagged, and that's of course a discriminatory risk. And it makes me wonder whether these algorithms really deserve the name of artificial intelligence, because it's mostly just really dumb statistics, right?
Yeah,
not intelligent at all.
Or even facial recognition. You know, I'm very famous for saying this is Bob recognition. These machines are trained to see one very particular type of human and pushing the rest of us out of the human data set, as it were, but they also don't work. So even as we think about the term artificial intelligence, Meredith Broussard at NYU wrote a book called Artificial Unintelligence, because these are science experiments that often don't work, yet we're spending billions of dollars deploying them across the world.
Exactly. Now, these companies, the examples of which we've seen, apologized for their biased algorithms and promised to make them better in the future. But really, maybe we can bring Ella here. What is the relationship or the connection between these kind of commercial algorithms that we've just seen and the public surveillance methods that are used here by police and governments?
Well, it's absolutely all connected. I've heard people refer to it as an EU or a global surveillance industrial complex, which is, I think, a really good way of describing what's happening in this facial recognition, Bob recognition industry. I really like that. There's the companies that have a vested interest in selling as much of these technologies as possible to customers, including law enforcement, municipalities, schools, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And to give a couple of specific examples in the EU context, we have companies that are developing facial recognition, which their own websites say can infer people's gender, people's race, people's age for advertising purposes. And these are the very same companies that are selling biometric surveillance technology to the EU, that are receiving so-called seals of excellence for their surveillance tech from the EU, and furthermore are being massively funded by the EU. Similarly, the companies that are selling smart doorbells are the same ones that have massive law enforcement contracts. And the example that I mentioned earlier of the biometric surveillance in the Italian municipality of Como, that used Huawei technology. And Huawei has been incredibly successful in pushing its so-called smart city tech to authorities across Europe, convincing cities that this technology is necessary, that it is legally compliant, when often we are calling them out and showing that it is not. And even beyond that, I think it's really important to remember that whilst inaccurate facial recognition and other biometric technologies can be very harmful, if it was all 100% accurate, it would probably be even worse, because it's going to be even better at profiling and targeting people and taking away their right and their ability to live with privacy and dignity.
Yeah, thank you for making that point, Ella. You're completely correct that even where these algorithms work, this facial detection would mean that you can basically track people offline and follow their movements. And oftentimes people won't even know if they are flagged in some database. Sometimes they are flagged not for arrest, but only for actually watching their movements, and they wouldn't even know. Often it's not the police, but it's actually intelligence services that are interested in their movements. And so you're fully right. This is not the only risk, but when it comes to discrimination, the risk is twofold. It's the bias in the algorithms, but it's also, as we've heard before, of course, the groups of people that are most in the focus of this kind of surveillance. So now that we have an idea of how these algorithms work and how they can have a discriminatory effect on the basis of race and gender, for example, let's have a look at the practical consequences of using these technologies in public space. And Mutali, you've already talked about this a little. In the US, the debate has progressed much further than in Europe already, especially in view of the Black Lives Matter movement, of course. And can you just remind us of some real-life examples of how these kind of surveillance technologies reinforce discrimination, and what their effect on certain communities are that have been more strongly affected than others?
Yeah, so there are three big cases that come to mind in the US. The first is in litigation now, and it was the Detroit police force. They arrested a man in April of this year, Mr. Williams, and what they said was CCTV camera had put him at the scene of a crime, stealing around $4,000 worth of merchandise from a store. The reason that $4,000 is significant to the story is that actually makes it a felony. So he would have been subject to much, much higher charges than if it were a lower cash amount. And when they arrested him, they contacted him via his phone, said he had to come in. He ignored it. They went to his house, arrested him between his wife and family, and in questioning, took him through processing. In questioning over 30 hours, said that they knew he was at the scene of a crime. And he was saying that he hadn't been there for 4 years. He was not even really aware of the store. He didn't frequent that part of town. And when they showed him the picture, they said the computer showed us that it was you. When they showed him the picture was of somebody else. The facial recognition system had made a mistake. But what they'd also done, and remember, this is in COVID, they had taken a Black person who is more likely to contract COVID in this country because of other forms of racism, put them into a communal environment, which is the arrest environment where COVID rates were higher than general population, taken them out of work. 30 hours is almost 3 days, and stop them from being able to pursue employment, and then put them through the trauma of arrest in front of a young child. I'm a parent, Patrick, I know that you're a parent. If my children were to see me arrested, that would be deeply traumatic for them and their sense of security. And they captured his actual biometric data, because part of the arrest protocol is that they took his fingerprints, they took his picture, and he now sits within this file. He was so traumatized by this and didn't really realize what happened and tweeted out, "This has happened to me, what should I do?" And the Civil Liberties Union of Michigan that covers the Detroit area got back to him. They developed a media strategy. His story was in the New York Times, and they're now going through litigation. Once that story came through, there was another story of another man in Detroit, another Black man misidentified in the same way. In that particular case, the company that was using the technology was a company called Real Computing, but the New York Times were able to find that that particular police department had contracts with Clearview AI, had contracts with other large facial recognition companies, which are not as well known. We know Clearview because of their scraping of social media, but many of these companies are not ones that we typically think of, and are now really looking for other examples where the police admit to using facial recognition, because that's really the only reporting system that they have. The campaign that I'm working with now in New York, where we're looking to take the lead of Massachusetts, which I'm so proud to say will become our first state through to ban police use of facial recognition, is the NYPD. And we know that within the NYPD system that there is use of Clearview AI and there is use of real rank 1 computing, which misidentified in the Detroit case. But there was an arrest this August of a Black Lives Matter protester who was allegedly put to the scene of a crime. He was besieged, his apartment, over 50 members of the police force came. They had a drone outside of his door, listening devices in his tree. There is a picture by Gothamist, which is a local newspaper here. And on the paper, it has a picture from his Instagram and then the words facial recognition scan on top of the picture. And the police initially, the NYPD initially said that they had used the technology and then detracted. So in that particular case, that one is another active case. I'm not so familiar with the litigation, but that's certainly an example where you have somebody who's engaged in peaceful protest, which is a fundamental right, a constitutional right in the United States. They're engaging in freedom of speech, which is another constitutional right, and their privacy is completely alienated. And so in that particular case, that person is actually looking to move from their apartment because of this fundamental loss of safety, because of the way the state has used these facial recognition systems against them. Those are only 3 examples. And as I keep saying, those are the 3 examples that we know of. But the massive lack of transparency around this means that we're not even uncovering the huge numbers of others. So we're looking, much like the campaign Reclaim Your Face, we're looking at FOIL requests. We're also looking at other publicly available databases, and also trying to find out how it's funded, because it's a mixture, at least in the NYPD, of private funds, as well as government funds, as well as other contracts. And really uncovering that is something that is particularly difficult for us.
Thanks, Vitali. But I think it's time to also bring in Gracie on this and the European experience. Gracie, do you have any real life examples over your side of our side of the world on how biometric surveillance technologies reinforce discrimination and certain communities are more affected than others?
Well, I suppose what I can do first of all is maybe talk a little bit about a case that Liberty took. I could talk to you about the Bridges judgment, and then I could build a bit more on kind of facial recognition and how it is and may be used against certain communities. So I can start there. And as some of you will be familiar with, the Bridges judgment, the Bridges case, is a case that was brought by somebody called Ed Bridges, who had his face scanned at least twice by facial recognition cameras that were being used by South Wales Police. I think one instance was on his lunch break, one instance he was at a protest. And he got in touch with Liberty about this. And so we became his lawyers. We represented him to challenge the use of facial recognition by South Wales Police on a range of grounds. And in August, a judgment was given by the Court of Appeal that found that South Wales Police had breached Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. They'd also breached the Data Protection Act 2018. And in addition, they'd breached the public sector equality duty. So it was a really encouraging and useful judgment. And, you know, it's a real testament to Ed in coming forward and bringing the case, and to my colleagues who acted for him. And so the court said some things about the adequacy of the legal framework, which I won't talk so much about now. But what the court said that specifically is germane to discrimination is that South Wales Police had failed to meet the public sector equality duty placed on them under the Equality Act. And that's a duty that requires public bodies and other people carrying out public functions to have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination. And so the court found that in deploying facial recognition, South Wales Police had never sought to satisfy themselves, either directly or by way of independent verification, that the software program in this case does not have an unacceptable bias on the grounds of race or sex. And the court went on to say that they would hope that all police forces that intend to use facial recognition in the future would wish to satisfy themselves that everything reasonable which could be done had been done in order to make sure that the software used doesn't have a racial or gender bias. So that was the legal discussion, the court's discussion of discrimination, which obviously gives some useful direction to police forces and also to campaigners against facial recognition. I think that in the UK specifically, what we really need to do, and I'm glad that this has been raised by other contributors in the panel today, that we really need to move on from talking about the bias that's inherent in the technology, and we need to talk about the contexts in which this technology is likely to be deployed. Because I think the reality is the technology will get better objectively. It will get better. It will get better at recognizing certain faces, you know, if the data sets are better and more diverse. The question is do we want a more effective mass surveillance tool? And what will the implications be for people who are already on the sharp end of state power? And I think that when you look at the fact that, for example, the Metropolitan Police in the UK, in England, conducted 10 trial deployments of facial recognition, and 4 in 10 of those deployments were in areas that had a high ethnic minority population. We saw that Notting Hill Carnival was targeted specifically. We also saw that racially diverse and working class areas like Stratford and Romford were targeted. You know, we didn't see deployment in places like Kensington and Chelsea, for example, although that is also quite a diverse area. But that we need to look at where these deployments are being made and who actually is the intended target of such deployments. When we think about who is generally construed as criminal or harmful in some way, right, that construction is racialized, it's gendered, it's classed. So even if the tech works, the implications are still likely to be discriminatory. And I think we can look, I find it fascinating in a lot of these conversations, not this one, it's been quite a refreshing conversation, but a lot of the time when I try to raise some of these points and I say, well, look at race disproportionality and stop and search, or all the way through the criminal justice system, people say to me, well, that's a problem with policing. That's not a problem with facial recognition. And we have to say, well, okay, but who do we propose that facial recognition technology is used by, right? We're talking about use by police forces. So actually those things are relevant. But I think we've seen a real concerted effort to drive those two parts of the debate apart, and for wider concerns around race discrimination in policing to be construed as irrelevant to the deployment of facial recognition. So we have to insist that kind of distinction is unacceptable, and that the two absolutely are relevant. And as I say, we need to look at other trends in the data, specifically when it comes to policing. If we think about the fact that London's Met Police had a gangs database, and it transpired that 72% of people on their gangs database were Black. But at the same time, we knew from official statistics that young Black people are only responsible for 27% of youth violence in the capital. So when we see disproportionality like that, I think it would be naive to assume that there wouldn't be disproportionality in deployment of this technology as well as in the tech itself. And I think that that aspect of the conversation has been missing in the UK. I know that you have views on the extent to which it's thought about in Europe, but we really need to bring that to the fore.
Well, thank you, Gracie, for making those true points and remarks. Let me, at this stage, remind our viewers that you can ask questions to all of our experts via YouTube comments, or else on Twitter as well. And Gracie, to follow up, with your legal experience that you've had, what do you think that the current framework, the human rights framework and the jurisprudence, etc., protects us sufficiently? Or would you say that there is a need and an added value to have a specific ban of these technologies, because it covers also the discriminatory effects inherent in the target audience and areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think we absolutely need specifically a ban. I think that, you know, that we're having conversations about whether it needs to be a moratorium, whether it needs to be a ban. I think the point is, right now, we need to say this technology shouldn't be used. That's the point that we need to get to. And I think we've seen in the UK, you know, the Bridges judgment sort of rightly said, now it's for politicians to, the judgment said the legal framework is inadequate. That means it's for politicians, right, to determine what the legal framework should be. And in a way, in the UK specifically, this conversation has started essentially with individual police forces in conversation with the Home Office. Parliament has been more or less circumnavigated. And I think that that's the forum in which we need to have this conversation. But ultimately, Liberty's view is that a permissive framework is absolutely is not acceptable. It's very difficult to see what safeguards could be put in place that would sufficiently mitigate the rights impact of a mass surveillance tool like facial recognition. And so as that conversation goes back to Parliament and back to politicians, what we are campaigning for is a ban.
Well, thank you, Gracie. And you seem to be very much on the same page as Edri here. So to bring Ella back in, the beginning of this year, Edri published a paper calling for a ban of these technologies, especially due to its discriminatory effects and the threats these technologies pose on fundamental rights. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that more and more governments are launching pilot projects to deploy these technologies. So what do you think is the state of awareness for the harmful effects of biometric mass surveillance in the EU? You know, not only in terms of privacy and discrimination, but also the power shift it may result in if this is used at a mass scale.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there is a growing awareness, but I think there can also be a sense of thinking, oh, it's too late, these technologies are already everywhere, or we already have laws to protect us against it, which can lead to inaction. But neither of those statements are actually true. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that people understand that these are really existential questions about what happens when every inch of our lives are watched, analysed, judged and labelled and then etched into our faces and bodies. And also that we're talking about what happens when our ability to organise, to protest, to live freely becomes attached to somebody else's often discriminatory interpretation of who we are in a way that's been mediated by technology. So on the power imbalances question, I just want to really briefly point to some new research by Mozilla fellow Petra Molnar, which EDRI has published, which I think really emphasizes one facet of this power imbalance and why we are calling for a ban on biometric mass surveillance uses. And this part of Petra's report features a man from Ethiopia who was interviewed about his experience with kind of border and migration technology. And he shared that in Belgium, he was approached by the police for sleeping in a park because he was homeless. He was handcuffed, he was taken to a police station, he was forced, and forced is his own words, to give his fingerprints. He was then kicked, hit, and excuse my language, but he was told to go back to your fucking country by the police, and then he was deported. So all these points, the points that Gracie just made about the structures around this, I think really become clear when you think about these real uses and these real people that are being really, really harmed. And rather than looking at the structural reasons, for example, of why people need to migrate, why people are homeless, for example, we're seeing our governments invest more and more into technology where, in essence, the powerful get to watch and the powerless are watched.
Yeah, since they are recording the images of immigrants already, of course, these kind of systems could easily be used to detect and deport them. That's true. Now, before bringing in our listeners' questions, Ella, let's talk about EDRI's campaign against biometric mass surveillance. It's called Reclaim Your Face. It was launched a couple of weeks ago. Website is reclaimyourface.eu. And can you briefly tell us what this campaign is about and what everyone can do?
I would love to. So Reclaim Your Face is a pan-European movement to resist biometric mass surveillance and to ensure that people are given a voice in these national and EU level decisions that will really impact how we're able to express ourselves and live our lives in the future. So now we have almost, I think, 20 to 25 civil society groups that have organized under the Reclaim Your Face banner, and almost 11,000 people across Europe who've joined our demands, which I actually feel in a democratic society, these demands should be a bare minimum for how we use biometrics in Europe. And that's to have transparency, so understanding not just how these systems work, but what is the motivation for them? What is the justification for their use? Can they be justified? Number two is red lines. In a democratic society with uses of technology, we're always going to have some no-go areas to protect us. And last but not least, respect for humans. We are calling for human rights, human dignity, and our democracy to be safeguarded in a way that we are not seeing right now. So currently people can join those demands by signing our petition and staying up to date, but we've got some kind of citizen action coming soon. We've got some legal action coming soon. So I'd say follow us and keep up to date, because we will be sharing lots of different ways that anyone across Europe who cares about our public spaces and our rights to not be discriminated against and to live equally isn't infringed upon by having facial recognition and other forms of biometric surveillance following us everywhere we go.
Thank you, Ella, for this great campaign, and please, everybody, check it out and follow it and sign to support the call for banning biometric mass surveillance. Now let's bring in our viewers and their questions. And there is a question to both Mutali and Gracie, and it says, besides a complete ban on facial recognition and biometric surveillance, what kind of safeguards could we build into AI legislation generally to tackle the data bias, to ensure that data sets are diverse and the data collection is performed in an ethical way? Do you want to start, Mutali? You're still muted.
I'm sorry. I would make the respectful suggestion that not all technology should be deployed. So I would rather reframe the question to say that in situations where deployment of the technology is not going to have a disparate impact on traditionally marginalized groups, one of the things that I have worked on in the past with a team that I led for the introduction of the Algorithmic Accountability Act was for impact assessment tools to be used and looking at existing legal frameworks that we had here in the United States, specifically Section 7 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that establishes protected groups, women, Black people, Native people, disabled people, these groups that will be continually most marginalized because of the history of the creation of the United States that really was dependent on the enslavement of African people and genocide of African Americans. And then those groups, as well as lack of legal recognition of white women. And those groups have never been able to catch up historically, given that this is such a young country. Under that statute, if particularly the federal government, but it has been adopted at other levels of government, are found to advance laws that promote that, then they have to be stopped. That is deemed illegal. And Facebook actually got into huge trouble in use of their algorithm around housing, where the ability to choose the race of the people that saw Housing Act was seen in violation. So we do have somewhat of a precedence around invoking Section 7 of the Civil Rights Law. That being said, that should not be in the case. I think Gracie made an incredible point, which I was backstage completely cheering for, was that the deployment of technology should not be uniform. In the case of facial recognition, the risks to facial recognition are so high for those groups most impacted. We need to really look back at some of the decisions that were made around the use of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima by the scientific community, where it was found that the impacts of that particular technical tool were so damaging to humanity that we didn't use them, and apply that in this particular case. In terms of ethical frameworks, I'm actually writing my first book, which is called Automated Anti-Blackness. And I argue that you have to be able to name the harm to legislate. Therefore, terms like ethics, which are very broad and say things like fairness and say things like privacy, don't speak to a specific harm that we, certainly as legal practitioners and also as advocates, can then go after and remedy. Therefore, if we're thinking about ethical frameworks, my recommendation is that we really start to marry the practice and the study of computer science with critical canons like feminism, Black feminism, queer studies, disability studies, Black studies, and we look at how histories of particularly in facial recognition, surveillance and control have been deployed against these groups. In closing, because I really am interested to hear from Grace, and I'm a huge fan, we can also see this use of criminalization of Black people via the face in historical statutes. So here in New York City, there was a law 1725 called the Lantern Law, which meant that Black people had to hold a lantern, which was the advanced technology of the time in terms of sight, against their faces in the way that I'm holding my hand now, so that white people would not be scared in the dark. Now, this is the 1700s, so there were no street lights. We couldn't see white people either in the dark. White people had also stolen Africans and placed them there. Therefore, if we're looking for a terrorist force, if we're looking for a dangerous force, criminalization of the victim, it doesn't hold any logical, kind of a logical thoroughfare there. Yet and still, we were still using technological processes to identify Black faces. And that's why I always advocate for a very genealogical view of not just design of technology, I'm complete in agreement with Gracie, but how the technology is used shapes our society. And I definitely agree for the UK and for Europe that is where the debate could certainly grow. But I will defer to what I'm sure will be amazing comments from Grace.
Thank you so much. No, that's really interesting. And I sort of hear you implicitly citing Simone Brown and others as you speak there, which is lovely. I mean, I think from my point of view and from Liberty's point of view, in a way, the human rights analysis is really quite good if anybody would actually do it. So if we started at least with the precautionary principle, and we said, okay, we're not going to deploy this technology operationally until we've done X, Y, and Z, that would be the start, just a precautionary principle rather than a rollout by trial and then everybody running to catch up. And I suppose implicit in your question about safeguards, I suppose what I'm saying about safeguards, and you have to have a kind of historical analysis of safeguards rather than just a strict legal analysis of safeguards, because the point is what we know is that we tend to see mission creep once we've said yes to something, right? So the initial purpose so let's say, and what we hear about for the sake of argument a lot is, well, what if we just had facial recognition when it was to do with murderers, terrorists, missing people, pedophiles, etc.? That's what we tend to hear a lot of. And of course, as a human rights organization, we absolutely sort of share society's aims in limiting the harms that come from those quarters. But I think what we see is that once there's been a yes, and state authorities, other authorities know that they can use a particular technology, we see the purpose creep, we see mission creep. And I mean, I think it's really starkly illustrated when you look at sort of investigatory powers in the UK, which were introduced, they were meant to be for very high level sort of defense of the realm and cybersecurity, etc. And then we found out that local authorities had been using investigatory powers law to spy on people that they thought were fly tipping, right? So that's what I mean when I talk about mission creep. And that's why I think when it comes to something like facial recognition, where the potential rights impact is so significant, it's unlikely that we can take the risk with safeguards that are unlikely to work. But I think at the very least, if we just had the precautionary principle and then a human rights analysis that said, okay, well, is the legal framework adequate? Is it for a good reason? Is it actually effective in achieving its purpose, in getting to that good reason? Because often tech falls down there. And then the proportionality analysis, which is so often missing, which says actually, are there any less restrictive alternatives that could be explored here? Because at the minute, the debate on facial recognition can be construed as it's either murderers have a free-for-all or we have facial recognition. And that proportionality analysis, A, doesn't take into account the less restrictive alternatives, but B, doesn't take into account what we lose as a society when we deploy mass biometric surveillance. If we just all wanted to be safe, there are lots of things that could be done. And many of us would agree that those things would be completely disproportionate and egregious and anti-democratic. So we need to look at what's on the other side of the calculus and do that proportionality analysis, and then we might get a bit further.
And the thing that I would add, that this idea that safety can only be secured through surveillance has to be interrogated. Safety comes from community. Safety comes from trusting government. Safety comes from civil debates that do not advance racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia. Safety comes from really being intentional about abiding by the laws we already have. And so it's only in a society where the rhetoric, the public rhetoric, is so divisive that we think the only way that we could possibly be safe is by looking at each other constantly and tracking each other, that this even becomes a point. I mean, the point that Gracie made around the gang database in London is mirrored here in New York. 90% of the people in the gang database by the NYPD are Black and brown. That includes children who have the same name as deceased gang members. So that includes babies under the age of 2. So it's inaccurate, but it's this idea that Black people are not safe that is now being encoded into these systems and given validity because it's tech. And we need to think about that too. I could, I'm writing a whole book about this, so clearly I could speak about this all day, but I would love to hear more questions.
We're all looking forward to your book, Mutali, but I fully agree that we are by no means safe in a country where the police have unfettered powers and know everything, because then they become the problem, really. And that's very important to discuss this conception of safety. So then we have a couple of questions to Ella, and we're running out of time, so we'll need to conclude after that. Ella, here are your questions. So do you know anything about how the EU is funding the use of biometrics in North African countries for halting illegal immigration? That was probably triggered by what you said about the use of this on immigrants. And then there's a question on, do you have any insight on the use of predictive policing in Europe? Because it seems that in the US, they are partially moving towards a ban on the grounds of racial discrimination as a result of these systems. And then finally, somebody asks you, since these facial recognition technologies are used more and more in Europe, is this a failure of the national data protection authorities? What can they do? What should they be doing to protect citizens against this?
Okay, lots of questions, not much time, so I'll do my best to get through those. So on the funding question, I won't profess to be an expert, but whenever I've needed to look it up, I've actually found really detailed funding information available on the European Commission's own website. So I would recommend looking there for more information. But in terms of many of the experimental biometrics projects that we've seen at EU borders, it's the Horizon 2020 program that has funded many of those. On some insight into predictive policing in Europe, I think it's a really important question. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, we heard lots of people saying, oh, but this doesn't happen in Europe. And there are so many people working at the forefront of anti-racism in Europe, including my colleague Sarah Chander in EDRI, who works across our AI work, that will tell you that that's absolutely not the case. ENA, the European Network Against Racism, released a fantastic report about data-driven policing and how data-driven tools, many different forms of them, have amplified and exacerbated the kind of underlying biases and structural discrimination across policing in Europe. So absolutely, it's a key issue, and in EDRI's work to define the limits of how we should use biometrics, we've similarly defined the limits of AI applications more broadly, and predictive policing is just as concerning a topic. And when we're thinking about using technology for people's judicial sentences or anything that can infringe on people's liberties and rights, I think we need to consider all of the points that we've raised across this webinar today, because it absolutely applies. And lastly, do I think that European data protection authorities have failed? No, I absolutely do not. I think that there's a lot of data protection authorities and information commissioners that are doing a great job with the resources that they have. But where I see the failings is where member states are not properly resourcing these data protection authorities, whether that's with human resources, whether that's with funding, or whether that's with political resources. And to be able to hold the various authorities and companies to account for their abuses of our biometric data across Europe, we're going to need so much more capacity for our data protection authorities to actually be able to hold them to account. And civil society will keep working and striving to do that, but that's where we need political resourcing.
Public pressure will definitely be crucial in Europe as well. And so thank you to all of you for covering these questions, for joining our debate, and for helping in forming this this important debate and bringing it to Europe as well. And before handing over the word to Kim, who will conclude our debate, I would like to invite everyone who's watching us now that you can receive updates about our group's campaign and the events that are still upcoming. And so if you're interested in receiving those, send us your email address and you'll be added to the mailing list. And now over to Kim.
Hello, and first of all, to thank the panelists, Mutale, Gracie, Ella, for your very valuable contributions today. And also a big thanks to my colleague Patrick Breyer and his office for this great webinar on discrimination and facial recognition. I mean, I think it's been a great webinar. I think so many things have been discussed, but I will try to give a short summary. I mean, not only is the entire principle of biometric surveillance an enormous breach of our right to privacy because it happens without our consent, let alone our knowledge, it is an extra dangerous one because of the risk of bias, systematic discrimination, and the mistakes. And we do not want a society in which people are automatically judged and classified based on their appearances. Judging people on their facial features inherently entails huge risk of racism. And this is something we have to keep on challenging. And especially as it is already being used on such a large scale, as Ella mentioned. There's a large risk of false positives and false negatives in facial recognition, even more so because of data bias. As Mutale said, there's 40% error rate for people with a dark skin, and it's enabled to recognize faces. People of color, and especially Black women, but also trans and non-binary people, are not recognized by facial recognition and not adequately represented in data sets. And even if they are, a report of the Fundamental Rights Agency notes that training algorithms can affect its accuracy. Low levels of light affect the quality of pictures of people of color, further increasing the risk of false positives. And as we heard today, algorithms systematically crop Black people of photos and misidentify female faces, especially with a darker skin tone. So such bias and false positives can have far-reaching consequences. We already heard that it increases power imbalances between the state and citizens and could lead to increased systemic racism by law enforcement authorities. I mean, imagine, without even knowing you're being tracked by such systems in the first place, from one day to the next, you can suddenly become a suspect due to a false positive. And then it's up to you to prove to the law enforcement officers it wasn't you, because the computer says it was. This sounds like a dystopian nightmare, but as we heard, this is already happening to some extent, and it will get worse if we don't fight against this. We must avoid such arbitrariness at all costs. And what further enlarges existing inequalities and the risks our panelists identified is that the very first areas where facial recognition is tested or used are usually the disadvantaged neighborhoods. Facial recognition is used against minorities and stimulates racial profiling. As Gracie said, Notting Hill Carnival is targeted specifically, and as Ella mentioned, the municipality of Como installed biometric surveillance in the area where migrants live, and to detect loitering in that area. Loitering, is that really a heavy crime that justifies biometric surveillance? I mean, this is why transparency about the rollout of these technologies is so important. And as Gracie said, even if technologies are better trained and make less mistakes, still, we need to be critical of it if and when and where we want to use these technologies. And we as Greens EFA are pretty clear on this, I think, because facial recognition in the public space can lead to systemic racism by law enforcement authorities. These are just risks we are not willing to take, and we really support a ban on facial recognition in the public space. So thank you all very much for all of you to join us today. This event was the kick-off of our Greens Ban Biometrics campaign. We'll be back in the new year with a public online event on the differences between facial authentication and facial recognition. And we hope to see you all there. And once more, again, to our great panelists.